Hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of RoboReplay. Today we're going to be covering some viewer matches that you guys suggested to me, as well as other matches that I found that I thought were really interesting and of note, and some strategies that I think might be interesting to look at. This week we're going to be looking at all the Week 4 events that I didn't get to cover, as well as doing a little bit of a point breakdown of the Israel District Champs to see what other District Champs might end up looking like in terms of ranking points. So let's get started at the Ontario District at the North Bay event and Finals 1 of Alliance 2 and Alliance 1 playing each other, and Alliance 2 would end up taking this matchup 2-0. And let's see why. As we can see here with the last 30 seconds left, that Alliance 1 and Alliance 2 are pretty neck and neck, right? Climbs can very much decide this match as there's only a 10-point gap. So what does Alliance 1 say? Alliance 1 tells their defense robot over here, they're going to, at the 25-second mark, 30-second mark, going to give up their post, let them score all the coral they want to do, and they're just going to wait for the climb. And we can see that they're very obviously waiting for the climb as they're literally just sitting here. They're not trying to defend algae at all. They're just trying to defend this climb. And so you can see here, right, 49-46 does have a clear path to get one L2 coral, and 610 has another free cycle that they'll be able to put in. But because of this, because they're not going as early, now 37-56 has a chance to just have full field open defense against 610 and this other robot here, and 49-46, and just be able to just try to scrape off as much time from their climb as they can get. So as we can see, they tried to go 18 seconds around. Yeah, so both these robots said that they wanted to start going climbing, right? 610 made the decision at around 18 seconds, and 49-46 followed suit. However, because of this interference that we see here, of just not being deep enough where if a robot was in the barred zone and you contacted them, you'd get a foul, but deep enough to where you're forcing them to make a lot of movement towards the cages, making the cages get knocked up and displaced, because they're not going to be able to control themselves because they're just trying to gun past you to get to the barred zone. Now we can see, right? 610 just hit a cage that was swinging because they took so much force to just move past this defense robot. Now this cage is like very out of position unless you have a good climber and you're really, really good at climbing. You won't be able to climb on that one nearly as fast as you would the other ones, or nearly as reliably rather. And 49-46 has the same thing happening where they didn't go nearly as far with their cage, but it's still swinging a decent bit. And we can see here that 49-46, because of that swing, ends up moving to the other cage, saying maybe we can take this one from the side, and ends up flashing onto the cage and pulling up, and 49-46 ends up getting up, and 610 never actually ends up getting to go up because of all the time that they just spent not from actually open field defending, but rather from forcing the Alliance 1 to just go barreling into their cages and forcing themselves to make the error instead of like doing the strategy of sitting in here and tanking the penalty just to stall a little bit more time off. Now what I think is really interesting here is that 49-46 actually never ended up getting the climb, even though they did climb, because their mechanism never ended up having the time to climb. And as we'll see in the match review here, we'll see that Alliance 1 ended up with final score of 172 points. And those 20 points obviously wouldn't have made a difference, right? It's still just been 92 to 203. But I thought it was really interesting how they decided to send the robot instead of going for maybe a park at the end there and just securing those points. They were choosing actively to risk their robot, maybe risk a 6-point penalty, because they thought the value of having the Alliance 1 potentially miss their climb was really, really important, which I think I agree with. Now, for our next event, let's move on to the FMA event that we saw this week with a ton of upsets. And I want to check out this processor defense strategy that people were running. Here we are in the FMA Ben Salem event. Sorry if I said that incorrectly, I'm not really sure how it's said. But here we are in the FMA Ben Salem event, and we have the Red Alliance of Alliance 1 going against Alliance 7 in the upper bracket. And these guys would end up making a run all the way to the finals. So let's check out what happened in this match that allowed Alliance 1 to actually just best them, even though they did end up winning through the lower bracket and getting to the finals. So first off, we can see here that 1712 is a processor robot, right? And 1712 is really, really good at being a processor robot. They were constantly getting in a ton of algae per match. And so what the Red Alliance has decided to do is say, even though they do have a tank robot as their third, and it's not a swerve robot, so maybe it'll get pushed down around a bit more, as you are able to push tank robots a pretty decent amount, as their wheels, if they're this way and they're not like a really strong drivetrain, right? If you have wheels this way and a swerve drive comes at you from this way, and your drivetrain is a little bit weaker, these wheels will inherently choose to roll backwards, just because of how tank drive works. So we can see that they've just parked themselves here, just behind the human player. It's a little bit hard to see, but they are parked here in front of the processor zone, and they are completely denying 1712 a bunch of points because they are a processor robot. That's why their strategy has been so effective for so long, and 1712 is actually the captain of this alliance. And one of the biggest things about defense against these types of robots, we saw it last week in Michigan, a lot of how processor robots were able to upset some pretty big alliances, and one of the ways that you counter that is by sending a defense robot over. But one of the biggest reasons that you would send a defense robot over, and not to say, let's just go stop the coral, is because this is really easy to defend, as the processor is a relatively small area in which you can score, in which the algae, relative to that, is pretty large. So there's a pretty small, we can see it on this side more, right? The processor window is this big, an algae is like this big, it's relatively that size, which means that you have to be pretty accurate with the algae in order to actually get it to go in, especially with how the algae bounces. And so what we can see here is the red robot just says, I'm just going to sit here because there is no safe zone here for blue that prohibits red from just sitting in front of the processor and just completely denying it. And so we can see here, we'll move forward. Once 1712 does get an algae, and they try to move in, the red robot is literally just going to hit them a little bit and just move them out of place, and then we'll see this algae over here, right? You can see it right on the top there. It's not going to go in, and it's still not going to go in because the red robot, it just constantly keeps hitting them. And this was one of the biggest ways that Alliance 7 was able to get points in later matches. And we can see that because of the fact that Alliance 7 wasn't able to get this processor nearly as much, right, just because of defense literally just sitting in front of here, it caused their score to absolutely tank. In matches where they would have been competitive in score-wise, they're now down 36 points because of that. Because of just how much the processor was giving them value, and now because of the lack of the processor, because it's so easy to defend, it's now getting completely shut down. So, again, there is a opportunity cost to processor defense, right? Because you're setting a robot to just in front of here, you're now leaving the coral robots to free cycle. But one of the biggest things with this Alliance 7 and the way it was made is that 1712 was a captain, meaning that they don't have two of the highest powered coral scoring robots, as well as the fact that they're Alliance 7, meaning that they wouldn't get to the best coral scoring robots at the event. So these two coral scoring robots, Red Alliance has deemed to say, okay, we think we can easily outscore these guys because we're Alliance 1, we're the first captain, and we chose first pick, the best coral robot at the event other than us. And so we think that we can easily outscore these guys, so let's let them do their triple offense, except we'll just make it so that they have to match us with Coral, which if we fully take away their processor, we don't think they can. And so by doing this is the one big way that processor offense gets shut down, and I think it is how you're going to see processor robots just getting defended in the later events. Maybe even if you see a processor robot get picked at DCMP, I think they might get kind of shut down unless they're picked as a third robot, in which case maybe you let them go free in favor of actually stopping the two coral robots, as the only reason this strategy works right now is because the processor robot is the biggest threat, and these two coral robots aren't nearly as much of a threat to the Alliance 1. Now, I wanted to break down how some people were playing defense on the open field collection and the ground intakes that we've been seeing throughout the entirety of this game, and how they've been really fast cycling, and seeing how people are trying to shut them down, specifically 179 and 180's Alliance in Orlando. Let's go check them out. So here we are in Orlando, and we've jumped to the middle of 37 seconds left in this match, and this match is pretty much won, right? I don't really care about the outcome of this match, as 179 and 180 are incredible robots. They were going to win this event together no matter what. But I do want to check out how they sent 22-152 to defend this ground intake robot of 1902. So let's see it. So we can see that, contrary to what most people have been doing, there's not nearly as much coral flooded on the ground as we've seen, like the 118s, the Highlanders, the Orbits, the Madtowns, all these different teams have been completely flooding the ground with coral, And we can see that Alliance 2 doesn't want to go with that strategy. And the reason that they're doing that is because 233 is a funnel robot, so they want to save some coral on either station that they're actually able to pick up from. So let's check it out. How 2152, we can see that 1902 is going to go for a coral here, and 2152 is going to defend this completely. And we'll see how this works. So 952 has their intake out, and 2152 has a pretty strong drivetrain. That is just something that they have. They've been doing pretty well defense with this, even against 233 before this. If you want to go check that out, it's a very interesting match about how 2152 defended it. But it is just the same fundamentals that we've been talking about of just blocking your opponent off from their own coral station. So I won't go into that again. But we can see that 2152 sees a stockpile of coral here on the ground and decide to say, we are just going to put our backs against this. And you cannot do anything about it, because if you come near us, it is now a pin on you. And 1902 just says, okay, yeah, you're right, and just walks away. And then they go back to defending 233, which they do a pretty good job of, right? This 1-1 score is absolutely tiny compared to what it could have been if there was no defense. But I want to just point out, even though that interaction was really small, I want to point out how I think this is probably going to be how people end up defending coral on the ground, and it's going to be when coral ends up in these stashes here, where there's a bunch of coral on an alliance wall, and maybe it's near a corner in this case, right, where you're able to actually put your back and say, if I'm here and you run into me, because we know the offense robots can pin, then it's now a pin on you for trying to access a coral, meaning that it's now entirely your fault for coming into the coral that you want to pick up, so get out of here. And another thing that they do that I think is great is they are constantly pushing 1902 to the side, where normally if you're picking up from a funnel, right, it doesn't really matter because a human player is able to just move it left and right and you can just put it in the funnel. But in the case of ground intake, since you're pushing to the side, the coral's now also moving to the side, meaning that if the robot isn't perfectly aligned to the coral or has their extender in a way where it's able to wrap itself around that coral perfectly, then it won't be able to collect it in the right orientation and won't be able to collect it and score it on the reef. So I think that this idea of trying to defend coral stashes rather than trying to do full field defense on these robots, right? Sure, you can try to play full field defense on 2056, but also there's a pretty decent chance that you'll get baited into a foul. Or instead, you could try to defend what their human player misses and the stashes on the wall. And that way, if they come into you, it's now a foul on them because they're going to be pinning you against the wall, because pins are transitive through game pieces. So that's something I thought was really interesting, an idea that I think we might see taken a little bit further at District Champs if robots do end up on big ground intake alliances and teams have to figure out how to stop them. But now I want to break down what happened at the Israel District event and what happened with ranking points in particular at that event. So here are the rankings for the Israel District Championship as they currently stand at 9:28 p.m. EST, so before the start of the second day. And of course, these rankings are going to change on the third day, and all this data might change later, but I just wanted to go over what I was talking about in the last episode of how I thought ranking points were going to work and show as to how they're working in a really competitive event. And so here we have what I've written here is just the points or RPs of where people were losing them. So for 1690, the way we read this is 1690 lost 2 auto RP in their matches, 1 barge RP, and 3 from just losing a match, which gives them a 36 RP total instead of their potential of what they could have had, which is 7 times 6 being 42. Right, so that's where they're losing their 6 RP. And so what I want to point out here is just mainly that a lot of people are losing coral RP. And even though loss RP is just something that'll, we don't really care about it because loss RP will just happen, right? Sometimes you'll just lose matches. What I really want to point out is the fact that coral RP, people are losing a significant amount, right? In 7 matches, one of these teams lost 4 of them. In 7 matches, another team lost 4, 3 losses in 8, 2 losses in 8, 2 losses in 7, right? These are not insignificant amounts of coral RPs that are getting lost, and that's not due to the fault of these teams being bad, for example. These teams are all really good teams. This is a really competitive event, and at the top 6, all these teams are trying to get all these RPs, and they could get these RPs. Right? The Coral RP is not that hard for these teams. They can definitely cycle enough. But what is interesting is that once you looked into this further, the matches in which Coral RP were missed. So we'll be taking 1690 out of this conversation, as they did get every single Coral RP that they could have scored. But for example, for 4414, in the matches of Coral RP that they could have gotten, they did not optimize for them in all 4 of the matches, right? They did not optimize them in all 4 of the matches, meaning that they could have scored enough Coral, and they did score enough Coral to get that RP in that match. So they did put the 20 Coral that they needed to get the score for that match, but they thought that they needed to win more than they needed the RP, so they ended up going with the win instead and doing more L4s and more L3s than going for the RP in general. And something else, in 2 out of 2 matches for 5990, the exact same thing happened. And for 5614, 4 out of 4 of their missed matches was also the exact same way. And for 2230, 3 out of their 3 matches was the same way. And for 5635, it was for 1 of their matches, but the other one, they weren't even able to score enough RP, so that was the one situation in which they weren't able to get enough Coral on the field for the 20 to even be met. So for most of these matches in which people are trying to get the Coral RP and they're failing, it's not because they're not putting up enough cycles, but rather it's because the competition is so high between these teams and the parity of this event is so high that teams are ending up saying, we can't focus this RP because we'll end up losing the match and dropping a ton of RP due to just losing a match rather than just dropping the 1 for Coral. So even though my theory before about Coral RP being relatively easy to get in terms of cycles was pretty spot on, the fact remains that Coral RP isn't hard to get, not because of the fact that people can't do it, but because of the fact that people aren't able to make a strategy where they feel comfortable doing it, because they feel like it'll cost them the win just for the Coral RP. So, after looking at this, I have a feeling that this might stay relatively the same for most of our district events or district championships coming up and these top level regionals, where yes, you can easily get Coral RP if you're trying to get the Coral RP only. But then in doing so, there is a potential for a loss if you're not confirmed, like the win in terms of your predictors before the match, and you decide to make a strategy saying, we're going to try to go for the win to get those 3 RP, instead of gambling on the 1 Coral RP. And that here, as you can see, right, this event is a pretty high event, level-wise, average-wise. As we can see, only 1 barge RP was missed throughout every single one of these teams, 2 for 5635, and most of the times teams were able to move, as 1690 was the only team along with 4744 that actually missed an auto RP. And for most of the people, the auto RP did end up being a problem. As for these teams that are ranking really high, you're always able to get that 1 core, at least 1 Coral in, and you'll have some sort of auto to push people off. So that's all for this episode. If you have more matches that are going to be coming up in next week, please put them in next week's video's comments, or this week's. If you end up finding a match in week 5 or this event that you love, I'll check it out next week. That's everything, and have a lovely day.